I realized, coming back, I don't know the exact date when I spoke here the last time, but it was sometime pre-COVID that I was here. It's interesting how we divide up our calendar now. There's pre-COVID, and we might not quite be post-COVID if the last few weeks have been any indication. Now, COVID was obviously a huge deal around the world. I remember I flew here from Canada in 2018 to take up my job here. And then 2 years later, we went through the season of COVID. And it was a stretching time being an international person with the borders closed. Because, on one hand, I was pretty lucky because my family in Canada had all the lockdowns that we didn't, by and large, experience. But just the fact they couldn't visit for those 2.5 years. Or I guess you could visit, but you might not get back into state if you tried to. But COVID was also a really positive time in my life. I remember I was dating before COVID, but I got married over the COVID season. And we had our first daughter over the COVID season. We have another one on the way coming in January. So a big development, coming here as a single person and then being married and have family, my life looked completely different going into COVID than coming out of COVID. Sometimes when we have these major life transitions, it can be a very positive thing. It's something we're excited about, but it can also be something that causes a lot of stress and anxiety. Entering into marriage, entering into parenthood or grandparenthood, or maybe some of you here have begun a new career, or you're going to a new school or to a new university. Maybe some of you are returning to study after being years away from that. Maybe some people here are going through the loss of a loved one, or all kinds of health crises, or even sometimes when we turn on the news and think about everything that's going on right now, or we worry about our environments, we can be kept anxious days on end about things. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about some of these issues, but we can have that unhealthy anxiety and stress about everything that's going on, whether in our personal lives or in our larger world. And as the body of Christ, when we go through these difficult seasons, because we all have to walk through this road, and we all have to have these transitions sometimes, but we don't all walk the same road. We need each other sometimes to lift each other out of these things, or we need our trained doctors and therapists and social workers to help each other as the body of Christ. Now, you might wonder, what does this talk about transitions and life change have anything to do with the passage that we read? I hope by the end of the sermon you'll see it might have everything to do with the passage that we read. So, this passage, Jesus walking on water, people don't really get what this story is all about, because it seems like a spectacular miracle that Jesus does. But we might say, well, what does that miracle have to do with us? How does it help or benefit other people? Like, it's great that Jesus was able to do this. And see, to reduce it for a moment, like we think of modern magicians, right? Like I think David Blaine and Chris Angel had this trick where they would walk across a pool, and we try to go, how did they do that? But sometimes we reduce Jesus' miracle to, oh, that's a neat trick. But it doesn't seem to matter to us beyond that. But I hope after this sermon we could talk about the deeper significance of what it is Jesus has done here. So to understand this miracle, we have to understand a bit about the background. And one of the first things is that in the ancient world, the sea for a lot of people represented chaos. And you might wonder, why does the sea represent chaos? Well, one thing is, even today, we often know more about space than we know our deepest, darkest oceans. So there's a bit of the unknown there when we look to the sea. What we do know sometimes can be pretty terrifying. So in Australia, we're all pretty familiar with sharks, right? And ancient people were familiar with them and other sea creatures as well. Ancient people were also familiar with floods and shipwreck and all kinds of devastation caused by the sea. And I guess at a basic level, the sea, life can't flourish there. At least human life can't survive and flourish there. We need the land for that. So ancient people used to tell stories about the sea, and especially their stories about creation and how creation came to be. And often these stories would have a god, and that god would battle a great sea monster. And out of this primordial battle, the god would win, and through it would create the land and civilization. So when the people told these stories, the king was the servant of the god, and the land that he ruled was like the ordered, civilized realm, and everything around it was chaos. That's how these stories functioned politically for ancient people. And we have these stories from Babylon to Canaan, which is where the Israelites settled. So if you remember the god Baal, you might hear about him in the Old Testament as one of the gods the Israelites were tempted to worship. He defeats the sea in some of the stories. So what does that mean for the biblical writers? The biblical writers also knew these stories. You may have heard about a creature called Leviathan in the Old Testament. Sometimes there's different names given for this creature. This is the sea monster, the chaos, symbol of chaos. And we hear about this creature in the Psalms and in the book of Isaiah and Job and other places. Job's the most interesting example because Job has gone through a great deal of suffering himself, as is starting to doubt the justice of God. Like, God, are you really in control when my life is spinning out of control here? And at one point, God, when he's impressing Job of who he is, he says, Job, have you seen Leviathan? Leviathan's just like a pet to me. He is nothing compared to who I am. So I really am in control. So this was a way of the ancient Israelites to say, our God, the God of Israel, is the one who's in control over the forces of chaos. Now we can turn to the story in the beginning of Genesis, the first creation account. And how does it start? Well, it starts with this image of waters. And it says it is formless and void. It's a bit of a terrifying image if you think about it. You think of black holes, right? Where nothing, it just sucks everything in and it's just nothingness. Kind of has that sense to it. But what's interesting about Genesis 1 is there's no battle scene in the story. God is in complete control. The first verse is, and the Spirit or the wind of God hovered over the waters. He's just in control, and he takes what's formless, and he shapes it and makes form out of it. And he takes what's void, and he fills it with all kinds of stuff. So he seems to create order out of what was seemingly disordered. So God is sovereign over the chaos. Think about some of the miracle stories in the Bible. So when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, God sent them Moses and all the plagues and helped deliver the people. But how did the people of Israel actually get out of Egypt? Well, through Moses, God divides the Sea of Reeds and they cross over as if it's dry land. But when their oppressors try to chase the Israelites, the sea collapses on them and sweeps them away. So one of the early songs in the Hebrew Bible, I remember we used to sing this as church. If you grew up in the church, I'm not sure it's sung much today, but it was a song about the Lord is victorious, the horse and the rider he's thrown into the sea. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that old song, but it's coming from this great victory God won over Israel's enemies. And this miracle gets repeated. So when Israelites are about to enter the promised land through Joshua, God divides the Jordan River so they can go through it. The prophets Elijah and Elisha also divide the Jordan River so they can walk through it. So it's like again and again we have this miracle reoccurring. Another interesting example is in Psalm 89. So you can look this up if you're interested. Psalm 89 starts with some praise to God. It praises God for the act of creation and also for God's control over the sea. So you see these two images combined. And it also praises God for this covenant that he's made with King David and his descendants. Basically, the covenant was like an agreement God made with them to say, King David, you and your son and your grandson and all your descendants will rule over my people. For as long as the kingdom endures, you're going to rule. And so it's praising God, but if you actually continue reading this psalm, it's actually a lament, because it was probably written at a time when the people of Judah lost the king. They had no more king. Their temple was burned down. Some of them were dragged away to live as foreign citizens in the land of Babylon. So Babylon came in and conquered them, basically. And they lived as second-class citizens in a land not their own. And the psalmist is saying, God, I thought you were in control here. I thought you were the creator, the one who's more powerful than the sea, the one who made these promises to King David. And now we've lost all it, and it looks like chaos has overtaken us again. And it basically ends in lament. And sometimes we need to hear that voice. You know, when we're going through moments of grief and suffering and chaos in our lives, God gives voice to our doubts and our skepticism and our, why, O Lord, or how long, O Lord. There's plenty of Psalms on this. So sometimes we need to just be in pastoral care for people who are going through these moments of grief, like Job was, for instance. But the psalmist, what the writer of the psalm could not see is how Jesus ultimately fulfills the story. Because Jesus, the descendant of King David, takes up that rule again. So now we can fast forward to Jesus in the story in Mark. Now, this isn't the first time Jesus does a miracle at the sea in the Gospel of Mark. Earlier, we had this story where the disciples are rowing and they're in a huge storm, and Jesus is sleeping inside the boat. It's kind of an echo of, the book of Jonah, where Jonah's running away from God. He's sailing to another area. God tells him to go one way, and he sails in the opposite direction. And a storm catches the boat while Jonah is asleep in the boat. So Jesus is doing this too. But when the disciples wake him up, they say, Lord, don't you care we're about to drown here? Jesus calms the sea and calms the storm, kind of what God does in the book of Jonah. The disciples don't get it. Who is this that the wind and the waves obey him? And now we have another story of Jesus going out to the sea. So Jesus had started on a mountain, and mountains are often very significant in the Bible. You think of Moses meeting God on a mountain and Elijah meeting God on a mountain. Metaphorically, we often talk about, I had a mountaintop experience, right? A mountaintop experience with God, and now we have to descend from the mountain and live it out in the day-to-day of our lives, right? So Jesus is with God the Father on a mountain. His disciples have already gone out to sea on their boat. So Jesus then comes out to them, but he's walking on the water. There might be an echo here of a verse in Job, where Job says God, Yahweh, is the one who walks on the water. He's the one in control. So what this story is telling us is that God the Father has authorized Jesus to do what God does, to have control over the sea. Just as God gave some of his other agents power to do things over the sea, Moses divides the sea, King David rules over the sea, but Jesus is so much greater than Moses and David. He is God's supreme agent, God's supreme self-revelation. Jesus comes and walks on the sea. He passes by the disciples and says, "It is I." And there are some scholars who think that this is an echo to when God is revealing himself to Moses, God passes by Moses. It's kind of symbolic language, but it's trying to say Moses can't see his full glory. He can only see a glimpse. And so now Jesus is passing by his disciples. And some think the Gospels were written in Greek, think it should be translated, Jesus says, I am, using the divine name for himself. I actually think some of that is an overreading of the story, but nevertheless, Jesus passes by the disciples so that they would follow him on the way. But of course, we see from the story that the disciples do not quite follow. Instead, their hearts are hardened. And there's again an echo. Remember when God shows his glory to Pharaoh of Egypt when the people were enslaved? And instead of Pharaoh saying, well, of course, God's supreme, he let the people go, his heart gets hardened in the face of what he sees. The disciples are kind of reacting like this as well. Their hearts are hardened. They don't understand. They're not comprehending. And this is a theme throughout Mark's gospel, where these disciples repeatedly, they don't get who Jesus is. They don't get what he came to do in terms of suffering and dying on the cross. And they're not willing to take up their cross and follow him. So Mark's gospel is really a story of Jesus' grace because he sticks with them and he keeps calling them back. And every time they fail, he's like, let's start again. And that's how Mark ends the gospel, where the disciples are like, come meet me back in Galilee and let's start again. And we'll see if you understand this time. If we turn to Gospel of Matthew, it's a little bit softer on the disciples. So I want to add a story to this story that Matthew tells us. So Matthew tells us that some of the disciples might have had some limited perception. After Jesus got back in the boat, the disciples worshiped Jesus and said, truly, this man is the Son of God. And Matthew uniquely tells a story about Peter in the scene. So Peter says, Lord, when he's on the water, Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come out of the boat so that I can walk on water too. Show me you can do this. So Jesus says, okay, Peter, come walk on the water. And so Peter steps out of the boat and he starts to walk on the water like Jesus. But then he sees the wind and the waves and begins to get terrified and starts to sink in the water. And that's something we can all sympathize with when we're going through these seasons of life where it's chaotic and out of control and all this hardship. We can feel like we're sinking in the anxiety and the depression of it all. But the positive news of the story is Jesus doesn't leave Peter sinking in the water. He reaches out his hand and grabs Peter and picks him up and brings him back safely in the boat. So this story for us is about Jesus is in control of the forces of chaos. He is sovereign, even when it doesn't look like it, even when we need all the faith that we can muster to believe in it, that Jesus is in control of the circumstances around us, of the crises in our personal lives, of the issues around the globe. And that, yes, we need to do our part to help one another, to make our world a better place. We're not called to leave that responsibility behind, but we can also entrust ourselves to God, entrust ourselves to Jesus, who is in control. And as the family of Christ, we can help one another out when we're going through these seasons. So I want to end on one more image about the sea in the Bible, and then I'll pray and invite the worship team up. So there's an interesting note in the book of Revelation. And Revelation is filled with chaos and violence. It's a deeply unsettling book. But it ends with this vision of the New Jerusalem, the new Garden of Eden when God restores everything. And it has this note, there's no sea there anymore. And many people probably don't understand that note. We'd say, there's no beach in heaven? Like, that sounds a bit depressing to us. I was talking about this in the middle of the service. But I don't think it's saying that. But what I do think it's saying is there's no more chaos. There's no more evil. Now God fully dwells with his people. The victory is complete. So we trust in God in the present circumstances, and we maintain hope for the future when God fully overcomes.